The thermometer inside Ewan McLeod's peculiar metal hut read 52 degrees, while his neighbor's cabin, just 200 yards away, registered 15 below zero. What seemed impossible that winter of 1881 would rewrite everything homesteaders thought they knew about surviving Montana's coldest months. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The Montana Territory. Winter of 1880 to 1881 entered the record books as one of the most brutal in frontier history. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Livestock froze standing in their pens. Water barrels cracked despite being stored indoors. Men burned through entire winter wood supplies by February and resorted to burning furniture, then fence posts, then anything combustible just to survive until spring. In a narrow valley 12 miles south of Helena, two homesteaders faced that winter in very different shelters. Duncan Rafferty lived in a traditional log cabin he had built the previous summer. The structure measured 20 feet by 16 feet, with a peaked roof, a stone fireplace, one window, and a sturdy plank door. It looked exactly like what a proper Montana cabin should look like. Solid, substantial, built to last. 200 yards up the valley, Ewan McLeod lived in something that looked like a joke. A half-cylinder of corrugated metal panels stretched barely 16 feet long and 12 feet wide. The curved roof gave it the appearance of an overturned bathtub, or perhaps a very large tin can. Neighbors had called it McLeod's tomb during construction. Some had called it worse. The two men had arrived in the valley together in the spring of 1880, filing homestead claims on adjacent parcels. They had worked side by side, breaking ground for their first crops, building fence lines, and preparing for the coming winter. But when it came to shelter, they had chosen radically different approaches. Duncan had built his cabin using techniques passed down through generations of frontier families. He had selected straight pine logs, notched them at the corners, chinked the gaps with moss and mud, and raised a proper structure in less than 2 weeks with help from other settlers. The cabin had cost him almost nothing except labor and time. Ewan had spent 3 weeks hauling corrugated metal panels from an abandoned mining camp 15 miles away. He had spent another 8 weeks building a wooden framework of curved ribs and fitting the metal panels with obsessive precision. He had mixed strange compounds to seal the joints between panels. He had installed insulation that seemed excessive for such a small space. He had put a glass panel in his door that everyone agreed would simply let heat escape. The entire project had consumed most of his summer. Duncan had tried to talk sense into his friend multiple times during construction. Metal conducts cold, he had argued. You will freeze. The structure is too small. Where will you store supplies? How will you live in something barely larger than a wagon bed? What happens when snow loads the roof? Ewan had listened politely and continued working. He had explained his reasoning a few times, talking about curved surfaces and thermal envelopes and heat reflection, but Duncan had not really understood. Most of the other homesteaders had not understood either. They had simply watched McLeod build his strange metal hut and assumed he would abandon it once winter proved them right. Now, in late December of 1881, the coldest winter in memory was putting both structures to the test. Ewan woke on the morning of December 30th, 1881, to absolute silence. The kind of silence that meant the temperature had dropped so low that even the wind had stopped moving. Inside his small metal hut, the air felt comfortable. Not warm exactly, but livable. He could see his breath, but only faintly. The small cast-iron stove in the corner still held coals from the night before. He dressed without urgency, added wood to the stove, and melted snow for coffee. Through the glass panel in his door, he could see the valley under heavy gray skies. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering everything in a blank white surface. Duncan's cabin sat 200 yards down the slope, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin column. except the smoke looked wrong, too thin, too dispersed. Ewan watched it for several minutes while his coffee heated. The smoke from a properly tended fire had a different quality, thicker and more continuous. This looked like the last remnants of a fire that had died hours ago. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots and walked down to Duncan's cabin. The snow came up past his knees in places where drifts had formed. The cold hit his face like a physical force, burning his exposed skin within seconds. He counted his steps, timing how long he could stay outside before frostbite became a risk. 200 yards. Perhaps 3 minutes of exposure. Duncan's door was not barred from inside. That was the first wrong thing. No homesteader left their door unbarred during winter. Ewan pushed it open and immediately felt the cold. The interior of the cabin was barely warmer than outside. His breath came out in thick clouds. The fireplace held only gray ash and a few unconsumed chunks of wood. Duncan lay in his bunk along the far wall, covered with every blanket he owned. Ewan knew before he crossed the room that his friend was dead. The absolute stillness, the frost that had formed on the blankets from Duncan's last breaths, freezing in the air. Ewan checked anyway, pulling back the blankets with stiff fingers. Duncan's face was peaceful. He had died in his sleep, probably never waking as the cold crept deeper into the cabin. The fire had gone out some time, after midnight. The temperature inside had dropped steadily. By dawn, the interior was cold enough to kill. Ewan stood in the freezing cabin for perhaps 30 seconds before his own survival instinct drove him back outside. He returned to his metal hut, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Duncan had not been careless. He had not been unprepared. He had built exactly the kind of cabin that thousands of frontiersmen built and survived in. But Duncan had died anyway, frozen in his own bed, while 200 yards away, Ewan had slept comfortably in a structure everyone had mocked as inadequate. The metal hut that was supposed to be a tomb had kept him alive. The proper log cabin that looked so solid had become exactly what the neighbors had predicted for Ewan's shelter. A coffin. 15 months earlier, in September of 1880, Ewan MacLeod and Duncan Rafferty had stood on a ridge overlooking the valley that would become their homesteads. Neither man had much money. Neither had family connections or political influence. What they had was the Homestead Act and the willingness to risk everything on 160 acres of Montana dirt. They had met in Helena, both looking for unclaimed land close enough to town for occasional supply runs, but remote enough that good parcels remained available. Duncan was 28, raised on a farm in Ohio, comfortable with traditional agriculture and construction. Ewan was 31, son of a Scottish stonemason who had immigrated to Pennsylvania when Ewan was 12. He had worked in coal mines, on railroad construction crews, and in a Pittsburgh ironworks before heading west. The valley they found was narrow, maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its widest point. A creek ran through the center, fed by snowmelt from the mountains, rising steeply on both sides. Timber covered the lower slopes. The valley floor offered perhaps 300 acres of potentially tillable land. Other homesteaders had already claimed parcels at the valley's mouth where access was easiest. Ewan and Duncan filed claims on adjacent parcels in the upper valley. The land was harder to reach, but it offered good water access and sufficient timber for building. They spent the fall of 1880 breaking ground for spring planting, cutting hay for livestock they did not yet own, and preparing for their first winter. The question of shelter divided them from the start. Duncan wanted to build immediately, using proven methods. A log cabin could go up in 2 weeks with help from neighbors. It would provide solid protection through the winter. They could refine and improve it over time, but the basic structure needed to happen fast. Ewan hesitated. He had seen too many poorly built cabins during his travels west, structures that leaked, that filled with smoke, that required constant fires to remain barely habitable. He had watched men freeze in cabins that looked solid from outside but had fatal flaws in their construction, gaps in the chinking, cold spots where walls met, roofs that leaked or collapsed under snow load. Duncan argued that perfect was the enemy of good enough. They needed shelter before snow fell. Traditional log construction worked because thousands of men had proven it worked. Trying to reinvent basic shelter was foolish when winter was coming. Ewan could not articulate exactly what bothered him about standard cabin construction, but something did. The corners where logs notched together always seemed weak. The chinking between logs always seemed to fail. The rectangular shape created cold spots where air did not circulate properly. And the size, most homesteaders built cabins as large as they could manage, assuming bigger meant better. They agreed to disagree. Duncan would build his cabin using traditional methods. Ewan would build whatever he thought would work better. If Ewan failed, he could shelter with Duncan through the winter. If both structures succeeded, they would have proven two different approaches. Neither man imagined that the decision would cost one of them his life. In late September of 1880, Ewan rode 15 miles northeast to investigate rumors of an abandoned silver mining operation. The claim had played out after 2 years of marginal production. The miners had left everything behind that was not worth hauling back to civilization. Ewan hoped to salvage tools, perhaps some hardware, maybe lumber, if the buildings were intact enough to dismantle. What he found was better and stranger than he had expected. The main camp sat in a narrow canyon, accessible only by a rough trail that had already started washing out. 3 log structures remained standing, their roofs partially collapsed. The mine entrance was boarded over. Tailings piled near the creek showed where the operation had processed ore. But off to the side, partially hidden by scrub pine, sat a structure unlike anything Ewan had seen on the frontier. It was a half-cylinder of corrugated metal panels, maybe 20 feet long and 12 feet wide. The panels were weathered but intact, fitted onto a framework of bent wooden ribs. The building had been used for equipment storage based on the rusted machinery parts scattered inside. Ewan walked around it 3 times, studying the construction. The metal panels were stamped sheet iron, corrugated for strength, overlapping slightly at their edges. Someone had sealed the joints with what looked like tar. The curved shape meant no flat roof to collect snow load, no corners where structural stress concentrated. The small footprint meant the interior volume was minimal. He pulled one panel partially free to examine how it attached to the wooden ribs beneath. Simple nails through the corrugation peaks into the wood. The ribs themselves were interesting, bent into curves and braced with cross members to hold their shape. The end walls were vertical planks, fitted into the curve of the roof. The structure had clearly worked. It had survived at least 2 Montana winters in an exposed location. The metal showed rust, but no holes. The framework had not collapsed. Snow had slid off the curved surface rather than accumulating, and the small size meant the whole thing could probably be heated with a tiny stove. Ewan spent the rest of that day examining every detail. He measured the radius of the curve. He studied how the end walls fitted to the curved sides. He looked at where the stovepipe had penetrated the roof and how that joint had been sealed. He noted which panels showed the most weathering and which had protected themselves through their positioning. An idea began forming, not to rebuild this exact structure, but to adapt its principles: curved metal skin for weather protection and structural strength, small interior volume for heating efficiency, no corners, no complex joints, no chinking gaps. Simple materials assembled in an unconventional way. He returned to the valley and told Duncan about the mining camp. Duncan was interested in the salvageable lumber and tools, but thought the metal building was a curiosity, not a model. Storage shed, maybe, not a dwelling. Metal conducted cold too efficiently. Everyone knew that. Ewan did not argue. He simply began planning how to dismantle and transport the metal panels. Ewan announced his intentions at a community gathering in early October of 1880. 7 homesteading families had claimed land in the valley, and they met periodically to share labor and coordinate on matters of mutual concern. The meeting took place at the Hendricks cabin near the valley entrance, the most established homestead in the area. When the conversation turned to winter preparations, Ewan mentioned his plan to build a small, curved shelter using salvaged metal panels from the mining camp. He explained that he believed the design would be more efficient than traditional log construction. Smaller interior volume, better heat retention, no chinking gaps, curved walls to prevent cold spots. The response was immediate and unanimous. Laughter, then concern, then attempts to talk sense into him. Thomas Hendricks, who had survived 5 Montana winters, spoke first. "Metal conducts cold," he said. "Everyone knows this. Touch a metal tool on a winter morning and your skin freezes to it." Building a shelter from metal was insane. Margaret Walsh, whose family had homesteaded the previous year, asked about the size. 12 feet wide, 16 feet long? Where would he store food? Where would he keep tools and supplies? How would he live in something barely larger than a prospector's tent? Duncan tried to support his friend while also expressing reservations. He acknowledged that Ewan had experience with construction from his ironworks days, but he also noted that proven methods existed for good reasons. Thousands of homesteaders had built log cabins and survived. Why reinvent something that worked? Ewan attempted to explain the physics as he understood them. Metal conducted heat, yes, but with proper insulation between the metal skin and the interior, that conductivity became irrelevant. The metal served as a weather barrier, not the thermal barrier. The small size was an advantage, not a limitation. Heating a small space required far less fuel than heating a large one. His explanations fell flat. These were practical people who trusted experience over theory. None of them had ever seen a metal dwelling. None of them had survived a winter in anything except wood or stone structures. The idea seemed dangerous at best, suicidal at worst. William Patterson, a carpenter who had helped build 3 cabins in the valley, offered to help Ewan construct a proper log cabin before snow fell. 2 weeks of work, he said. Everyone would contribute labor. Ewan would have a real shelter that would keep him alive through winter. Ewan declined politely. He thanked them for their concern, but said he intended to proceed with his plan. If it failed, he would accept responsibility for that failure. He was not asking anyone else to take the risk with him. The gathering ended with general agreement that McLeod was making a fatal mistake. Several people told Duncan privately that he should prepare space in his cabin for Ewan when the metal shelter proved uninhabitable. Duncan said he would, though he hoped his friend would reconsider before things reached that point. Ewan left the meeting understanding that he had isolated himself. The community thought he was foolish, stubborn, or both. No one would help with his construction. No one would validate his approach. He was on his own. He returned to his claim and began planning the salvage operation in detail. Ewan spent 3 weeks in October dismantling the mining camp structure and transporting materials to his homestead. The work was tedious, physical, and solitary. Duncan helped for 2 days, then returned to his own cabin construction. The other homesteaders watched from a distance but offered no assistance. The metal panels proved more difficult to remove than Ewan had anticipated. Years of weather had corroded some of the nails holding them to the wooden ribs. He had to work carefully to avoid bending the panels, which would compromise their strength and make them harder to refit. Each panel was roughly 3 feet wide and 8 feet long, corrugated for rigidity, and heavier than it looked. He developed a system. Pry nails carefully using a wrecking bar. Lower each panel to the ground without dropping it. Stack panels in groups of 5 with wooden spacers between them to prevent scratching. The wooden rib framework he dismantled separately, saving pieces that were still sound, and discarding those that had rotted. Transportation was the greater challenge. His wagon could carry perhaps 8 panels at a time, along with some framework pieces. The trail from the mining camp to his homestead was rough, with several steep sections where he had to lead his horse carefully to prevent the load from shifting. Each round trip took a full day. After the first trip, several neighbors saw what he was hauling. Thomas Hendricks stopped by to examine the corrugated metal panels stacked near Ewan's building site. He ran his hand over the rust-streaked surface and shook his head. "This will kill you," he said simply. "When you freeze, do not expect us to feel guilty about it. We warned you." Ewan continued working. 6 trips to the mining camp. 48 metal panels total, plus framework lumber, a small cast-iron stove he found in one of the collapsed building's stovepipe sections, and various hardware. By early November, all materials were on site, and Ewan began construction. Duncan finished his own cabin in mid-October and spent several days helping other homesteaders with their preparations. He cut firewood, helped repair a barn roof, and assisted with slaughtering hogs. When he returned to check on Ewan, he found his friend digging foundation trenches in ground that was already starting to freeze. The trenches formed a rectangular outline 12 feet wide and 16 feet long. Ewan explained that he was creating a level base filled with gravel for drainage. Duncan pointed out that most cabins simply sat on the ground or on a few flat rocks at the corners. The elaborate foundation seemed like wasted effort for a structure that probably would not survive winter anyway. Ewan kept digging. He hauled rocks from the creek to fill the trenches, creating a perimeter foundation that would keep the wooden floor frame off the ground and prevent moisture damage. The work took 4 days. Duncan stopped commenting and simply watched, occasionally helping when Ewan needed a second pair of hands. By late November, the foundation was complete, and Ewan began building the curved rib framework that would support the metal skin. The curved wooden ribs were the structural skeleton of Ewan's design. Each rib needed to be identical in shape, strong enough to support the metal panels and snow load, and precisely spaced to distribute stress evenly. Ewan had no formal training in structural engineering, but he understood intuitively that the arch was one of nature's strongest shapes. He started by creating a template. Using green willow branches that could be bent without breaking, he formed a half circle with a 12-foot diameter. He adjusted the curve until it looked right, then traced the shape onto a large piece of salvaged lumber. This became his pattern. The ribs themselves he built from 2x6 planks salvaged from the mining camp. Single planks were not long enough to form the complete curve, so he had to join sections. He cut precise angles where pieces met, overlapped them by 2 feet, and bolted them together with iron hardware. Each completed rib consisted of 3 sections forming a smooth arc from ground level on one side, over the top, to ground level on the other side. He built 9 ribs, total, spacing them 2 feet apart along the 16-foot length of the structure. Each rib was identical. Each one took half a day to construct. Duncan visited during this phase and expressed grudging respect for the carpentry. The ribs were well made, he admitted, but he still thought the entire project was misguided. Ewan erected the ribs one at a time, securing their bases to the foundation frame and bracing them temporarily with diagonal supports until all 9 were standing. The result looked like the skeleton of some enormous animal, or perhaps a boat hull turned upside down. Neighbors riding past stopped to stare at the strange curved structure rising near Ewan's claim. Between the ribs, Ewan installed horizontal crossmembers called purlins. These ran lengthwise along the structure, connecting all 9 ribs and preventing them from twisting or collapsing inward. He spaced the purlins 18 inches apart, creating a grid pattern across the curved surface. The metal panels would attach to these purlins. The end walls presented a different challenge. The curved ribs created a half-circle opening at each end that needed to be closed with vertical walls. Ewan built these from salvaged planks, cutting the top edge of each wall to match the curve of the ribs. He framed a door opening in one end wall and a small window opening in the other. By early December, the framework was complete. The structure looked increasingly strange to outside observers. The curved skeleton seemed fragile, almost delicate. Most homesteaders built heavy, solid-looking structures. This looked like it might blow away in the first strong wind. Ewan knew better. The arch distributed weight efficiently. The multiple ribs meant no single point of failure. The cross members prevented racking or twisting. The framework was actually stronger than it appeared, capable of supporting far more weight than the metal panels and snow load would impose. He began fitting the metal panels, working from bottom to top on one side, then repeating the process on the other side. The corrugated metal panels were unforgiving material. Unlike logs that could be notched and adjusted, or planks that could be trimmed to fit, the metal panels had fixed dimensions and rigid shapes. They either aligned properly or they did not. There was no middle ground. Ewan started at the bottom of one side, positioning the first panel against the curved ribs. The corrugations ran horizontally, creating a series of ridges and valleys across each panel's surface. He had to align the panel so its edge sat precisely on a rib, allowing him to nail through the corrugation peaks into the wood beneath. The first panel went up easily enough. The second panel, positioned directly above it, revealed the central challenge. The panels needed to meet edge to edge with minimal gap. Overlapping them would create ridges that disrupted the smooth curve. Leaving gaps would allow wind and cold to penetrate. He discovered that the curved surface magnified small errors. A panel that seemed properly aligned at one end would be off by half an inch at the other end. That half inch multiplied across multiple panels would create unusable gaps or force panels to buckle where they should lie flat. Ewan developed a measuring system. Before positioning each panel, he measured from fixed reference points on the framework to determine exactly where the panel edges should fall. He marked these positions with chalk. Only when the measurements confirmed proper alignment did he nail the panel in place. The work was slow. Each panel required multiple measurements, careful positioning, and verification before fastening. He used short nails driven through the corrugation peaks, spacing them every 12 inches. Too few nails and the panel would flex or rattle in wind. Too many, and he risked splitting the wood ribs or creating unnecessary penetrations in the metal. Duncan visited in mid-December and watched Ewan spend 2 hours installing a single panel. At that rate, Duncan calculated, finishing the entire structure would take weeks. Winter was already here. Temperatures were dropping. The framework offered no protection from wind or snow. Ewan acknowledged the slow pace, but refused to rush. A poorly fitted panel would compromise the entire structure. Gaps would let cold air penetrate. Misalignment would create stress points where panels might tear free during storms. The precision was not perfectionism. It was necessity. He worked through December, fitting panels methodically from bottom to top. The curved surface gradually disappeared beneath the metal skin. Where ribs had been visible, now only corrugated iron showed. The structure began to look more solid, more intentional, less like an experiment and more like actual shelter. By Christmas of 1880, 3/4 of the panels were installed. The structure was still open at the top where the final curved sections would meet. Snow fell through this opening, accumulating on the dirt floor inside. Ewan slept in a tent near his work site, rising each morning to continue fitting panels in numbing cold. Neighbors thought he had lost his mind entirely. Building a cabin should not take this long or require this much obsessive attention to detail. But Ewan kept working. Installing the panels was half the challenge. Sealing the joints between them was the other half. Ewan understood that even perfectly fitted panels would leave hairline gaps where edges met. Those gaps would allow air infiltration, destroying the thermal efficiency he needed. He began experimenting with sealing compounds in early January of 1881. His first attempt used pine tar, a traditional frontier sealant. He heated the tar until it became liquid, then applied it to the joints between panels using a brush. The tar filled the gaps adequately, but when it cooled and hardened, it became brittle. The metal panels expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The rigid tar cracked, reopening the gaps it was meant to seal. His second attempt used a mixture of clay and water, similar to the chinking used between logs. The clay stayed flexible when dry, but it did not adhere well to the metal surface. It could be scraped off easily, and the first rain would wash it away entirely. Ewan needed something that would adhere to metal, remain flexible through temperature cycles, resist water, and cure into a durable seal. No traditional frontier material met all those requirements. He would have to create something new. He started with rendered animal fat from a hog Duncan had slaughtered in December. Fat had natural water resistance and remained somewhat pliable when solid, but fat alone would not adhere to metal or hold its shape in a vertical joint. He added pine resin collected from trees near his claim. The resin provided adhesive properties and structural integrity. Mixed with fat, it created a sticky compound that would hold in vertical applications. But the mixture remained too soft, liable to drip or sag in warm weather. The breakthrough came when he added finely ground charcoal dust to the fat and resin mixture. The charcoal acted as a filler, giving the compound body and structure. It also darkened the mixture to black, which Ewan discovered would absorb solar heat during the day and help warm the structure passively. He refined the proportions through trial and error. Too much fat, and the compound stayed greasy. Too much resin, and it became brittle, like the pine tar. Too much charcoal, and it would not adhere properly. The correct ratio was roughly 3 parts rendered fat, 2 parts pine resin, and 1 part charcoal dust by volume. Preparation required patience. He rendered the fat by heating it slowly until the solid portions melted and the impurities settled out. He collected pine resin by cutting small wounds in pine bark and gathering the sap that oozed out, then boiling it to remove moisture and concentrate the sticky compounds. He made charcoal by burning dry wood in a covered container with limited air, then grinding the resulting char into fine powder. The final compound had to be applied warm. He kept it in a small pot suspended over coals, maintaining a temperature where it remained liquid enough to work, but not so hot that it smoked or degraded. He applied it to panel joints using a thin wooden spatula, working the compound into gaps and smoothing it flush with the metal surface. As it cooled, the compound formed a flexible seal that moved with the metal but did not crack or pull away. Sealing the exterior joints solved air infiltration, but Ewan understood that metal conducted heat too efficiently to serve as the sole thermal barrier. He needed an insulation layer between the metal skin and the interior living space. The question was what material to use and how to install it. Most frontier insulation consisted of whatever was available, mud packed between double walls, dried grass stuffed into gaps, newspapers when available, animal hides. None of these options seemed adequate for Ewan's design. He needed something that would fill the curved space between the metal panels and the interior wall, provide genuine thermal resistance, and remain effective for years. He settled on a mixture of 3 materials. The base was sawdust from a small mill operation 10 miles down the valley. The mill operator was happy to give away sawdust, which he otherwise burned or left to rot. Sawdust provided good insulation because of the air pockets between particles, but it settled over time and absorbed moisture. To prevent settling, Ewan mixed the sawdust with dry prairie grass cut from his own claim. The long grass fibers tangled with the sawdust, creating a matrix that resisted compression. To prevent moisture absorption, he added dry clay dust that he had collected and ground fine. The clay absorbed any moisture that penetrated the outer seal and prevented the organic materials from rotting. He mixed these components in roughly equal proportions, creating a dry, lightweight insulating material. The mixture had to be installed before the interior wall went up, packed into the cavity between the metal skin and the inner framework. Ewan built an interior wall framework using thin wooden strips attached to the curved ribs. This created a 4-inch cavity between the metal exterior and the interior wall surface. He packed his insulation mixture into this cavity section by section, working from bottom to top. The packing density was critical. Too loose, and the insulation would settle, leaving gaps at the top. Too tight, and he would compress the material, reducing the air pockets that provided thermal resistance. He aimed for firm, but not compressed, testing each section by pressing on it to ensure it had some give, but would not shift. The work was tedious and dusty. Sawdust and clay powder filled the air inside the partially completed structure. Ewan wrapped cloth around his face to avoid breathing the fine particles. His hands became raw from handling the rough mixture, but gradually the cavity filled with insulation that would provide the thermal barrier the metal skin alone could not. For the interior wall surface, he used thin planks oriented vertically, attached to the curved framework. These planks did not need to be structural. They simply held the insulation in place and provided a finished interior surface. He fitted them carefully, creating a smooth interior that showed no gaps or rough edges. By late January of 1881, the insulation was complete and the interior was habitable. The door represented Ewan's most controversial design choice. Standard frontier doors were solid planks reinforced with cross-bracing, designed to keep weather and animals out. Ewan built something different. His door featured a glass panel occupying the upper third, allowing light to enter and providing a view of the valley outside. Duncan saw the glass panel during a visit in late January and immediately questioned the decision. Glass conducted heat poorly compared to wood, he argued, but it conducted heat far better than a solid insulated wall. The glass panel would bleed warmth from the interior, especially during the coldest nights. Why create an intentional weak point in the thermal envelope? Ewan explained his reasoning, using concepts he had observed during his time working near foundries and ironworks. During the day, even in winter, sunlight carried heat. A south-facing glass panel would allow that solar heat to enter the structure. The dark interior surfaces would absorb the heat and radiate it back into the space. Over the course of a sunny day, the passive solar gain could add meaningful warmth. Duncan remained skeptical. How much heat could weak winter sunlight really provide? And what about nighttime, when the glass panel would simply radiate heat outward into the freezing darkness? The losses would exceed the gains. Ewan had a solution for nighttime heat loss. He built an interior shutter from thick planks, heavily insulated on the outward-facing side with layers of felt and canvas. The shutter hung on hinges attached to the interior wall. During the day, it folded back against the wall, leaving the glass panel exposed. At night, he could close the shutter, creating an insulated barrier over the glass. The door itself was built with the same precision he had applied to the rest of the structure. The frame was mortised into the end wall, creating a solid connection that could not be forced. The door planks were thick pine, joined with tongue and groove joinery for strength. Iron hardware salvaged from the mining camp provided hinges and a latch mechanism. He positioned the door on the south-facing end wall, maximizing sun exposure. The glass panel was salvaged window glass, 4 small panes held in a wooden frame that was mortised into the door structure. The glass was wavy and imperfect, but it allowed light to pass and provided visibility. When Ewan closed and latched the door for the first time in early February, he stood inside his completed structure and looked out through the glass panel at the snow-covered valley. Light filled the interior despite the small window on the opposite end wall being shuttered. The space felt less claustrophobic than he had feared. The curved walls and ceiling created an impression of more volume than the actual square footage suggested. That night, he lit a fire in the small cast-iron stove and closed the interior shutter over the glass panel. Within an hour, the temperature inside had risen to comfortable levels. He needed far less firewood than he had anticipated. The small stove, fed modestly, heated the entire space efficiently. The metal hut was complete. Now it needed to prove itself. Ewan moved into his completed structure in early February of 1881. The true test would come during the following winter, but late winter provided an initial assessment of the design's functionality. Temperatures still dropped below zero most nights. Wind swept down the valley regularly. Snow continued to fall, though less heavily than in December and January. The first thing Ewan noticed was the absence of drafts. In every log cabin he had visited or occupied, air movement was constant. Cold air seeped through chinking gaps, around windows, under doors. You could feel the drafts as distinct cold currents moving across the floor or down from the ceiling. Inside the metal hut, the air was still. When he held a candle flame near the walls or door, it did not flicker. The second observation was how quickly the space heated. His small stove, loaded with a modest amount of firewood, brought the interior from freezing to comfortable within 30 minutes. Duncan's cabin, which Ewan had helped build and visited regularly, required hours to warm up and needed a large fire continuously burning to maintain livable temperatures. The curved walls created unexpected acoustic properties. Sounds inside had a slightly hollow quality, different from the dead absorption of log walls. But this was a minor oddity, not a problem. More importantly, the curves seemed to promote air circulation. Warm air from the stove rose to the curved ceiling, spread along the arch, and descended along the walls, creating a natural convection current that distributed heat evenly. Duncan visited in mid-February and spent an evening inside the metal hut. He had to admit that the interior was comfortable, warmer than he expected, no drafts, but he attributed this partly to luck and partly to the newness of the construction. "Give it a few months," he said. "The seals would fail. The insulation would settle. The structure would develop problems." Ewan did not argue. He simply continued living in the space, monitoring its performance. He kept mental notes of how much firewood he consumed compared to Duncan's usage. His friend was burning roughly 4 times as much wood to heat a space less than twice as large. The efficiency advantage was significant. The glass door panel proved its worth on sunny days. Even when the outside temperature was well below freezing, sunlight streaming through the glass warmed the interior noticeably. Ewan could let his fire die down to coals during the brightest part of the day and still maintain comfortable conditions. At night, closing the insulated shutter prevented heat loss through the glass. Snow accumulation on the curved roof was minimal. The arch naturally shed snow, which slid off under its own weight before building up to dangerous levels. Duncan's peaked roof, by contrast, accumulated heavy snow loads that had to be manually removed to prevent structural damage. By late March, as winter began releasing its grip, Ewan had confidence in his design. The metal hut had performed well through late winter conditions. The real test would come during the following winter's deepest cold, but the initial results suggested that his unconventional approach was sound. The autumn of 1881 was unusually warm, delaying the onset of serious cold. Ewan and Duncan both completed their harvests and prepared for winter with optimism. The crops had been adequate. Both men had preserved food and cut firewood. The valley's small community had grown to 9 homesteading families, all making similar preparations. The cold arrived suddenly in mid-November. A storm front moved down from Canada, dropping temperatures 30 degrees in 6 hours. Snow fell heavily for 2 days. When the storm passed, clear skies allowed temperatures to plummet further. By November 20th, nighttime lows were reaching 15 below zero. Duncan burned firewood at an alarming rate. His cabin, which had seemed adequate during the previous winter, revealed weaknesses under the sustained cold. The chinking between logs had dried and cracked over the summer. Gaps had opened that he had not noticed during warmer months. Cold air infiltrated constantly. The corners of the cabin stayed cold regardless of how large a fire he maintained in the fireplace. He visited Ewan on November 22nd, ostensibly to check on his friend, but also seeking relief from his own cold cabin. Inside the metal hut, he found Ewan comfortable in shirt sleeves, a small fire burning in the stove. The contrast was jarring. Duncan's cabin required him to stay within a few feet of the fireplace to remain warm. Ewan's entire small space maintained even comfortable temperature. Duncan examined the walls, looking for the source of heat he assumed must exist beyond the small stove. There was none. The stove, barely 2 feet across, was the only heat source. Yet the space felt uniformly warm. He placed his hand on the interior wall, slightly cool to the touch but not cold, not radiating the penetrating chill that log walls transmitted from outside. Ewan explained again the principles he had used. The sealed metal exterior stopped air infiltration. The insulation layer prevented heat conduction through the walls. The small volume meant less cubic footage to warm. The curved shape promoted air circulation. Every element worked together to retain heat efficiently. Duncan understood intellectually, but struggled to accept emotionally that this small, odd structure outperformed his substantial log cabin so dramatically. He asked about firewood consumption. Ewan estimated he was using 1/5 the wood Duncan burned, maybe less. The small stove needed only modest fuel to maintain temperature. The conversation turned to Duncan's situation. He was burning through his firewood supply faster than anticipated. At current consumption rates, he would run out before spring. Ewan offered to share his wood supply, but Duncan declined. He would cut more. The forest provided unlimited fuel if a man was willing to work for it. But cutting firewood in deep cold was brutal labor. Duncan returned to his cabin that evening and spent a restless night, his fire burning constantly but the corners remaining cold, drafts moving across the floor despite his attempts to block them with rags and clay. December 28, 1881, began with clear skies and bitter cold. The temperature at dawn was 20 below zero. By afternoon, it had climbed only to 10 below. Duncan spent the day splitting firewood, his axe ringing against frozen logs. Each swing required tremendous effort. The wood split reluctantly, the cold making it harder and more brittle. He carried the split wood into his cabin and stacked it near the fireplace. His supply had diminished alarmingly. He calculated that he had perhaps 3 weeks of fuel remaining if he maintained current consumption. But reducing consumption meant accepting colder interior temperatures. He was already uncomfortable most of the time. That evening, Duncan built a large fire. The flames roared in the fireplace, consuming wood rapidly but finally pushing enough heat into the cabin to make the space bearable. He ate a simple meal of beans and salt pork, then added more wood to the fire. The stack beside the fireplace diminished visibly. Around 9 o'clock, he banked the fire for the night. This involved arranging the burning logs to create a slow, sustained burn rather than high flames. Done correctly, a banked fire would maintain coals through the night, making it easy to restart flames in the morning. But banking reduced heat output significantly. Duncan wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and lay on his bunk. The cabin temperature began dropping immediately. He could feel the cold radiating from the log walls. The corners of the room stayed perpetually frigid, as if the cold itself pooled there like water. Drafts moved across the floor despite his attempts to seal the gaps. Outside, the temperature continued falling. By midnight, it had reached 35 below zero. The clear sky allowed ground heat to radiate into space unimpeded. The cold was absolute, crushing, dangerous to any living thing exposed to it. Inside Duncan's cabin, the banked fire consumed the last of its fuel around 2 in the morning. The coals glowed for perhaps another hour, then faded to ash. Without the fire, the cabin temperature dropped rapidly. Cold seeped through the log walls, through the gaps in chinking, through every imperfect joint and unsealed crack. Duncan did not wake. The cold crept over him gradually as he slept. His body tried to maintain core temperature by restricting blood flow to extremities, by shivering, by burning stored energy. But the cold was relentless. His core temperature dropped degree by degree. His breathing slowed. His heart rate decreased. Hypothermia is often described as a gentle death. The body simply stops fighting and accepts the cold. Duncan's last moments were unconscious, his brain shutting down as his body temperature dropped below the threshold necessary for life. He died sometime between 4 and 5 in the morning, frozen in his own bed. 200 yards away, Ewan slept comfortably. His small stove held coals that would last until morning. The interior temperature of his metal hut stayed above 40 degrees even as the outside world froze solid. Ewan found Duncan's body on December 30th. He had noticed the absence of smoke from Duncan's chimney the previous day, but assumed his friend was visiting another homestead. When no smoke appeared the second morning, Ewan walked down through the knee-deep snow to investigate. The discovery devastated him. Duncan had been his closest friend in the valley, his partner in homesteading, the man who had helped him despite doubting his building methods. And Duncan had died from the very thing Ewan's design was meant to prevent. The cruel irony was inescapable. The structure that everyone mocked had kept Ewan alive while the proper cabin had killed its occupant. The community gathered for Duncan's burial 3 days later. The ground was frozen too hard to dig a grave, so they built a cairn of stones over the body in a sheltered spot Duncan had favored. The service was brief. Everyone was acutely aware of the cold and the need to return to their own shelters. After the burial, Ewan made a decision. He would document the temperature difference between the two structures with objective measurements. Subjective impressions could be dismissed, numbers could not. He had 2 mercury thermometers salvaged from the mining camp. He installed one inside his metal hut and one inside Duncan's abandoned cabin, both positioned at the same height from the floor. For the next 2 weeks, Ewan recorded temperatures 3 times daily. Morning readings at dawn, midday readings at noon, evening readings at dusk. He maintained a small fire in his own stove as usual, but left Duncan's cabin unheated. The results were stark and consistent. On January 10th, during a particularly cold spell, the outside temperature at dawn was negative 37 degrees. Inside Ewan's metal hut, the thermometer read 52 degrees. Inside Duncan's cabin, it read negative 17 degrees. The difference between the two structures was 69 degrees. Similar patterns held across multiple readings. Ewan's hut consistently maintained interior temperatures 50 to 70 degrees warmer than the unheated log cabin. Even accounting for the fact that Ewan heated his space while Duncan's cabin sat cold, the comparison was meaningful. Duncan had been heating his cabin continuously and still freezing. Ewan heated his minimally and stayed comfortable. Ewan compiled his temperature records in a notebook, creating a table that showed outside temperature, metal hut interior temperature, and log cabin interior temperature for each reading. The data told an undeniable story. The metal hut's thermal performance exceeded the log cabin's by a massive margin. He showed the records to Thomas Hendricks during a supply trip to the valley entrance. Hendricks studied the numbers silently. Finally, he acknowledged that the results were remarkable, but he also noted that correlation was not causation. Duncan had died because his fire went out, not because log cabins were inherently deadly. Ewan agreed, but pointed out that Duncan's fire had gone out because maintaining adequate heat in that cabin required constant attention and massive fuel consumption. The design made survival difficult. His own design made it easy. Word of Ewan's temperature measurements spread through the valley community during January of 1882. Reactions were mixed. Some homesteaders dismissed the data as irrelevant or flawed. Duncan's death was tragic but exceptional, they argued. Thousands of people survived winters in log cabins. One death did not invalidate centuries of proven construction methods. Others were curious. William Patterson, the carpenter, who had offered to help Ewan build a proper cabin the previous year, visited the metal hut in mid-January. He spent an hour examining the construction details. He noted the precision panel fitting, the ceiling compound, the insulation layer, the door design. He asked detailed questions about each element. Patterson acknowledged that the workmanship was excellent and the results were impressive, but he remained skeptical about scalability. Building this structure had taken Ewan months of obsessive effort. Most homesteaders could not or would not invest that kind of time in shelter construction. The techniques might work, but they were impractical for general use. Margaret Walsh visited with her husband in late January. Their cabin had developed significant drafts over the winter, and they were struggling to stay warm despite burning firewood constantly. Inside Ewan's hut, Margaret stood near the center of the room and slowly turned, examining the curved walls and ceiling. The space felt warm and still. No drafts, no cold corners. She asked if Ewan thought the design could be adapted for a family. Her household included herself, her husband, and 3 children. They needed more space than Ewan's small hut provided. Could the same principles work for a larger structure? Ewan thought carefully before answering. The curved design could scale up, but larger sizes would require more robust framework and more complex construction. The efficiency advantages might diminish as volume increased. 2 homesteaders made concrete plans to build similar structures before the following winter. Samuel Wright, a bachelor trapper who spent months away from his claim, wanted minimal shelter that would survive unattended. The metal hut design appealed to him because it required no maintenance and could be secured easily. Peter Larson, whose family had nearly run out of firewood during the current winter, was motivated by fuel efficiency. His firewood consumption was unsustainable. He needed shelter that could be heated with less fuel. Ewan agreed to help both men with their construction projects when weather permitted. He would share his techniques freely. The knowledge had cost Duncan his life. If it could save others, that gave Duncan's death some meaning. But the majority of Valley residents remained unconvinced. They continued building and living in traditional log cabins, accepting the drafts and cold spots and massive firewood consumption as normal parts of frontier life. Change came slowly, especially when it required abandoning familiar methods. The winter of 1881 to 1882 became known throughout the Montana Territory as the Long Cold. Temperatures stayed below zero for weeks at a stretch. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel nearly impossible. Wildlife retreated to sheltered areas or died. Livestock perished despite the best efforts of their owners, and people struggled to survive in shelters that were inadequate for the relentless cold. Ewan's metal hut performed flawlessly. Through January, February, and into March, he maintained comfortable interior conditions with minimal firewood consumption. His daily routine was simple. Wake, add wood to the stove, prepare breakfast, complete necessary chores, return before dark, bank the stove for night. The structure required no attention beyond basic fire tending. Other homesteaders fought constant battles against the cold. Thomas Hendricks burned through his entire firewood supply by late February and had to begin burning fence posts and furniture. The Walsh family crowded into a single room of their cabin, abandoning the rest of the space because they could not heat it adequately. William Patterson developed frostbite on 3 fingers while cutting firewood in sub-zero conditions. In late February, a homesteader named Robert Chen lost his cabin to structural failure. The accumulated snow load on his peaked roof exceeded the capacity of his support beams. The roof collapsed inward, destroying the interior and making the structure uninhabitable. Chen and his wife moved in with neighbors, creating overcrowded conditions in an already stressed household. Ewan's curved roof continued shedding snow naturally. No accumulation, no structural stress. The design that had seemed fragile and inadequate proved more robust than traditional construction under extreme conditions. Spring arrived in late March, bringing temperatures above freezing and melting the massive snow accumulation. As the valley emerged from winter, the toll became apparent. 3 deaths in the broader region from cold-related causes, multiple cases of frostbite and cold injuries, destroyed structures, depleted resources. Ewan's metal hut stood unchanged. The metal panels showed no damage. The seals remained intact. The insulation had not settled or failed. The structure had survived the worst winter in memory, with no maintenance and no repairs needed. The contrast between Ewan's experience and his neighbor's struggles was undeniable. In April, Samuel Wright and Peter Larson began construction on their own curved metal shelters. Ewan helped them salvage materials from an abandoned mining operation and taught them the panel fitting techniques. Both men were motivated by direct experience of the previous winter's hardships. They had seen their own structures fail to protect them adequately. They had watched Ewan survive comfortably while others suffered. The construction process went faster with Ewan's guidance. What had taken him months alone took Wright 6 weeks with help. Larson's structure, built slightly larger to accommodate his family, required 8 weeks. Both structures were completed before summer ended, ready for the following winter. Word spread beyond the immediate valley. Trappers, miners, and isolated homesteaders heard about the metal shelters that had survived the long cold with minimal fuel consumption. Ewan McLeod never profited from his innovation. He shared his techniques freely with anyone who asked, helped with construction projects when his own work allowed, and answered questions from homesteaders throughout the region. He considered the knowledge community property, earned through Duncan's death and validated through his own survival. Over the following 5 years, variations of curved metal shelters appeared throughout Montana Territory and into Wyoming. Mining camps adopted the design for equipment storage and temporary worker housing. Trappers built small versions at remote trap lines. Isolated homesteaders constructed them as primary dwellings or secondary structures for workshops and storage. The designs varied based on available materials and individual skill. Some builders used flat metal sheets instead of corrugated panels. Others substituted different insulation materials based on what was locally available. A few attempted larger structures that sacrificed some thermal efficiency for more living space. But the core principles remained consistent across variations. Curved surfaces for structural strength and snow shedding. Sealed metal exterior to prevent air infiltration. Insulation layer for thermal resistance. Small volume for heating efficiency. Professional builders in established towns dismissed the curved metal shelters as primitive expedients suitable only for temporary situations. Proper houses, they argued, required traditional materials and construction methods. But in remote areas where survival was more important than convention, the practical advantages of Ewan's design made it appealing. Ewan himself left the Montana Territory in 1886. He had proven his homestead claim, established a productive farm, and saved enough money to pursue opportunities elsewhere. He moved to Oregon, married in 1887, and worked as a carpenter in Salem. He built conventional houses for paying customers and never mentioned his Montana innovations unless specifically asked. Duncan Rafferty's grave remained on the hillside above the valley, marked by the stone cairn built during that brutal winter. Ewan visited once before leaving Montana, standing in the spring sunshine and thinking about the friend whose death had validated a theory but cost a life. The irony never faded. The structure that everyone mocked had worked exactly as intended. But knowing it worked and proving it worked had required Duncan to die in the traditional shelter everyone trusted. The metal hut Ewan built stood for 37 years. Subsequent owners maintained it with minimal effort, replacing worn seals occasionally but finding the basic structure sound and functional. In 1918, a forest fire swept through the valley. The metal hut survived while surrounding wooden structures burned. Eventually, time and neglect led to its abandonment. But even derelict, it remained standing when similar-aged log cabins had collapsed. Modern historians estimate that variations of Ewan's curved metal shelter design saved between 20 and 40 lives over the 2 decades following the long, cold winter. The exact number is unknowable, because survival leaves fewer records than death. But accounts from the period reference the shelters multiple times, noting their thermal efficiency and structural resilience in conditions that destroyed conventional buildings.